Hey HSM, Sarah here. For this final week of Jesus and Dinosaurs, we put a poll on HSM's Instagram to put the power in your hands to choose this final week. And you chose the topic of God and evil. Most of us can all acknowledge that we live in a world where evil exists. In recent history, we have experienced terrorism threats and attacks, an increasing amount of school shootings, and generally a true crime and murder mystery obsession that's a little out of hand. We are well aware of the horrible things that happen in the world, whether it be war or racism, acts of violence, all at our fingertips through Instagram and TikTok. And maybe you've heard these stories or seen the news or seen the horrific images of war and thought, how can God let this happen? If he is good, how can he allow this evil? Well, buckle up. We're gonna do a deep dive and answer the question many of you were asking for. So one helpful approach to solving the problem of evil has to do with defining evil. There's a Christian thinker, his name's Augustine, and he defined evil not as a thing in itself, but as a parasite on good. Something that's kind of lacking is not a thing in itself. Think about it in this way. If you have a hole in your jacket, right? The hole is not something, but rather it's something that is lacking. Similarly, Augustine considered evil something that is missing. Indeed, it requires good to exist because it's like a parasite. In this sense, he's defining evil as the lack of good. So this already solves some important criticisms. If evil is not a created thing, then God cannot be the creator of evil. God is the creator of good. But we make moral choices that result in evil, and we're going to talk more about that in a second. Another important question wrapped up in this topic is, does evil argue against the existence of God? Is there no referee up there monitoring the game, right? Atheists, skeptics, and other critics of Christianity often argue against God on the basis of the reality of evil and suffering. See, they say, since evil and suffering exist, God must not exist. But do evil and suffering really mean that God does not exist? Well, some Christians actually respond by turning this argument on its head. They do this by asking, on what basis is something deemed evil, like we just talked about? If there's some moral standard the critic is basing their position on, then the problem of evil becomes an argument for, not against, the reality of God. After all, in order to call something good or evil, there must be an underlying standard of right and wrong. And Christians argue that this standard is rooted in God and his nature, like we talked about a few weeks ago. We know his moral law exists, so we recognize the reality of evil and suffering, but unless there is a moral standard, we have no real basis for calling anything good or evil. Hence, their argument proves the existence of God and not the reverse. So let's keep pushing. You guys with me? Elbow the person next to you to make sure they're locked in. To really answer this question, we need to look at why evil even exists. Did God create evil? Why would he do that? The answer is twofold. For one thing, God could have made a world with absolutely no evil in it. He has that capability. However, it would have been one of those robots and puppets type of world, creatures who could not love him or anything else on their own. Love is possible only for free moral creatures. Forced love is a contradiction. So in order for the world to be morally good, it must be morally free. I'm gonna say that one more time. In order for the world to be morally good, it must be morally free. And free creatures are capable of free choices. That has ultimately led to the moral evil we see in our world. God loved us enough to design each of us to have free will. And it's kind of as simple as this little formula. Free will plus our sinful nature equals the evil we see in our world. But in God's goodness, even he has purpose for evil. When we have a relationship with him, even evil can have purpose. In The Problem of Pain by C.S. Lewis, he explains a second point about suffering. He says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. The painful truth is that God is more interested in our holiness than in our happiness. He is more interested in our character than in our comfort. And he will use the trying times that are the result of the moral evil around us to draw us closer to him and sharpen us. 2 Corinthians verse 4:17 puts it this way. For our very present troubles are small and won't last very long, but they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. And even more than that, God is going to fix it up. But he hasn't done it yet. Here's the age-old dilemma. If God is all good, as the Bible says, then he would want to get rid of evil. If he's all powerful, then he could do it. Well, because God has not yet defeated all evil, doesn't mean that he will never defeat it. Indeed, both good logic and the Bible declare that he will do away with evil. How so? But when God restores the world to its original design and sin no longer exists, evil will be conquered and no longer reign. This has not happened completely yet, but part of the plan has actually already taken place. Because God has already done something about evil. Part of this plan is that he sent his only son into the world to die for the world and to defeat evil. Evil was defeated officially at Christ's first coming through his death and resurrection. Hebrews 2:14 says this. It says, because God's children are human beings made of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, who had the power of death. His victory over sin and the grave ensured evil's eventual defeat. The same Bible that accurately predicted Christ's first coming through nearly 100 fulfilled prophecies promises that Christ will come again and will completely defeat evil. So meanwhile, while we're living in this world that's full of evil, what do? We turn to God. We get to know who he really is. We trust in his goodness to work in the midst of evil situations and know he will redeem and defeat all evil in this world. And he sent his son to die for us as the beginning to that redemption. Let's talk more about this God and evil topic in our groups.